that has been throughout our nation's history. Every time we have an ally, every time we make a promise to a certain country, we end up fulfilling that promise. Now, and this has been a lot of the justification for a lot of our military involvement in the Middle East, most particularly in the area I'd like to discuss today, which is the second question on your list. Was the U.S. intervention into the Syrian civil war worth it? And I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to say yes because principally this actually was an aspect of us being loyal to our allies and us fulfilling our promises. And so that's why it's been very worth it for us to intervene in Syria. And my main source for this entire speech, and other sources will be listed as we go, but my main source is a lady named Liz Sly, who writes for Reuters News Agency and is based in Beirut. So first of all, what's the first reason why we're being loyal to our allies and keeping our word? Well, that is support for the Kurds. And no, I'm not talking about cottage cheese, which is my favorite snack. I'm actually talking about an ethnic group based in Iraq and Syria. This is an ethnic group that has been fighting together with us against ISIS since about 2015, and ISIS really exploded onto the world stage. And essentially what this was is we promised that we would be in Syria to help them defend against ISIS, to defend against other threats, and to bring stability. Now you might be wondering, well, ISIS isn't the same thing as the Syrian rebellion. What do these two things have to do with one another? And you'd be very right. The issue is, when we're involved in Syria and in support of the Kurds, what happens is that these different forces fighting in this Syrian civil war, which just for reference is the Sunni populace, the majority of the people in Syria, fighting against their Shia overlords, their Shia government in Bashar al-Assad. And what these two words are is they're the different sects of the Islamic religion, and the split happens over who ought to be caliph. Who ought to be the person who leads the Islamic religion? Should it be the direct descendants of Muhammad, as the Shia believe, which is about 5% of the Islamic population globally? Or alternatively, should it be whoever is the most learned in the Quran, as the Sunnis, and about 90% of the world's Muslim beliefs? And then the other 5% is a bunch of smaller sects that really aren't involved in the Middle East, or particularly in this story at all. And so by fighting with the Kurds against ISIS and therefore giving aid to people in the Syrian civil war also to fight against ISIS, what we're doing is we're keeping stability in the region. We're actually protecting our allies. And this is important because what ends up happening is not only do we express support for these particular people, but we also act as a bulwark against aggression for other countries. As a matter of fact, Liz Sly talks about the grave threat that Turkey poses to the Kurds. Now, why is this? Well, this is because Turkey is actually massing an army on their border to come into Syria and to invade the Kurds, to try to conquer them. That has been their objective since the Peshmerga, the Kurdish militia, started being active against ISIS in 2015. And this is what Liz Sly says, quote, Turkish officials reiterated their threat on Thursday that they, meaning the Kurds, can dig tunnels and ditches if they want, they can go underground and hide if they want, but they will be buried in their own ditches. You see, Turkey is incredibly antagonistic against their allies, the Kurds, and we've promised to remain in Syria, and we're fulfilling our promise by participating and giving aid in the Syrian civil war, and that's accomplishing this strategic aim. What's the second reason? Well, the second reason why it's been worth it to be involved in the Syrian revolution is that we've checked our historical opponents. Now, what are these historical opponents, you may ask? Well, really, it's the historical opponents, Iran and Russia. You see, Iran and Russia are on different sides of this Syrian revolution, this Syrian civil war. You see, Iran is really supporting the people, the current government, Bashar al-Assad, who's used chemical weapons against his own civilians and is overall not a great dude that we don't get along with very well. And Turkey is supporting the rebels because they are also very antagonistic towards the Kurdish people, and they persecute them because they practice a different Islamic sect as well. And so because of these two confluence of factors, this means that giving aid to the Syrian rebels and also defending the Kurds means that we keep stability in this region and we check these two historic adversaries, Iran and Russia, who are sponsoring Bashar al-Assad and the current Sunni or Shia government in Syria, and we're also checking Turkey, who's sponsoring these Sunni rebels. So this out of the way, I'd like to move into the third and final reason why this has ultimately been worth it. And I think this is actually the most important reason. And the sources for this comes from the Daily Wire. And this is because it has increased stability in this revolution and has brought a level of humanity to this war. And I have to talk about each of those two things. First of all, stability. What does this mean? Well, the United States obviously is a very stable country, and stability, as you might know, also affects the global economy. If things are not going to change drastically, then the economy tends to go up, excepting certain unforeseeable circumstances. But if things are in turmoil, if the U.S. doesn't act as a stabilizing force in other countries, that can lead to an economic downturn, both for us and the rest of the world. And even on this economic argument alone, saying that we're keeping stability in this very unstable region, the Middle East, which has been a source of violence since the Ottoman Empire went away at the end of World War I, that alone is an economical reason for that it's worth it for us to be involved in this conflict and give aid to the Syrian rebels and make sure they don't topple Bashar al-Assad very violently. But the second reason is that of restoring humanity. And this is because, as you might know, President Trump, well, relatively recently, last year, bombed all of the Syrian chemical weapons facilities because Syria was using these illegal chemical weapons against their own civilians. And these weren't just the Syrian rebels who were fighting against them. That maybe is understandable even though it's against international law. But they were also using it against innocent civilians who were even on the side of Bashar al-Assad. Women and children were killed by this chlorine gas attack from their own government. And so the U.S. being involved in Syria, their military weapons, their decision to launch, I believe it was 19 Tomahawk missiles at various Syrian chemical weapon facilities, meant that this punished this irresponsible action. And so for both of these reasons, both the economic and moral reason, I think that our intervention has been worth it. Thank you all so much for your time.